Hello, everybody out there. This is Nat Eliason, and welcome to another episode of Nat Chat, where, as you know, or are just finding out, we're currently focusing on what to do as a college student who is not so excited about a world of lectures, one-size-fits-all careers, and that common road to nowhere. In this interview, I am joined by Ben Nelson, who is the founder and CEO of Minerva Schools at KGI. If you don't know about Minerva, you're going to be really excited about it after this interview. It is probably the biggest movement, biggest company, biggest effort right now to displace the current university system. Ben is a really interesting guy who has built this new university, Minerva, from the ground up over the last 6 years, and they currently have their first 3 years of students going through it. There's really no way to compare it to an existing university system. They've reimagined it from the ground up. And if I were going to university today, this is exactly the kind of school that I would want to look at. So through this interview, we mostly focused on, what Minerva is doing in order to create a better college, but also a bit around how people actually learn and what that has meant for the curriculum at Minerva. If you're interested in education, whether through institutions like universities or on your own, I think you'll find this really valuable. And if you're like me and you're really excited about alternative education possibilities for the future, Minerva is one of the most exciting ones out there right now. I'll also say that Ben has a book coming out very soon, and it is called Building the Intentional University, which you can get a link to in the show notes. It should be out, I believe, early October. So depending on when you're listening to this, it might be out, it might be still pre-order. Definitely pick it up. It sounds like it goes very deep on the study of how we learn in a very technical way, which I really appreciate. I imagine a lot of you will appreciate too. But without further ado, let's bring Ben on and learn more about Minerva. Ben, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited to dive in here. And the audience has a little bit of background on what Minerva is, but I'd be really curious to hear how you describe it. So if you were at a cocktail party or just ran into someone and they wanted to know, hey, what is this Minerva Schools that you're working on? How would you describe it?
So Minerva actually has two different components. So the first component, the one that's most visible to pretty much everybody around the world, is the Minerva Schools at KGI, which are today the most selective, most effective university in the history of the United States. And they were set up to be a model for how a university should be, as opposed to how a university may have accidentally evolved into being over the past couple of hundred years. So it's an institution that's built strictly on first principles, thinking about what it is that we want the students to learn over the course of 4 years that they can then apply in the real world, and then working backwards, not just to design the curriculum and the pedagogy used in that process, but also the entire institutional design. So that's the first piece of what people mostly encounter in Minerva. Now, there's a second piece, which is actually a corporation that built a lot of the intellectual property that was effectively gifted to the university for free to run this nonprofit operation. But the corporation's job is to enable other universities to follow in Minerva's footsteps, which means that if Minerva, the schools, do not produce outsized impacts for their students and what we teach them and how we're able to do that, obviously no other university should ever license the material, since it doesn't make any sense.
So you said that it's the most effective university in the country, and that's a pretty big claim.
Yeah, it is a big claim. And it's one where we weren't able to say that before because we had the suspicion that it was designed to be, but now we actually have the data around it. So I guess you want to take a step back and ask yourself, or the audience should ask themselves a little bit about what a university education is about. And there's a pretty good hints out there to figure out what a university education is about, because you can just read the brochures and the literature that any other university puts out, right? And so, if you go and have a conversation or you read the brochures of other universities, they shockingly don't say, we teach you political science and gender studies and, mathematics. Right? They say we teach you how to think critically, we teach you how to solve problems creatively, we teach you how to communicate effectively, we teach you how to be a global citizen, etc. All of the things that we all know are actually necessary to thrive in whatever career you pursue. But if you actually have a conversation with a university leader and then you ask them, well, how do you do those things? Show me in the curriculum where you teach any one of those things that you're saying that is the purpose of your university. It's like, well, we have political science and gender studies and mathematics, and then you learn the other stuff by accident, right? But that's in some ways saying, I'm going to teach you how to cook by teaching you how to dance, right? And you go learn dance, and then, you'll figure out how cooking on the side, which is, of course, absurd. And so years and years ago, there was a nonprofit set up that created a test called the Collegiate Learning Assessment, the CLA Plus. And it was the basis of a book written by Richard Aron a few years ago that was subtitled Minimal Learning on College Campuses. Because what the CLA has shown is that, when you actually test students for critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, effective communication skills, especially in reading and writing, it turns out they don't do substantially better from when they take the test as entering freshmen versus graduating seniors. Right? They have some improvements in some colleges, of course, but not as nearly as dramatic as if that were the point of the university. Now, we came across this test because when we launched Minerva and we were talking about it, people said, there's actually a test for this stuff. You should actually keep yourselves honest and give your students the test to see how they do. And we said, sounds like a good idea. And so we gave the test to our incoming freshmen. And the incoming freshmen had, they had very good results. We're a very, very selective school, et cetera. And so when you look at the incoming class on average on these measures, thinking critically, creative problem solving, effective communication, these are not really things that any university, including Minerva, screens for, because, you screen for a bunch of other stuff, how you did in high school, et cetera. But our incoming students were at the 96th percentile of the incoming students in any university, which is, of course, very, very high. They're excellent students. But if you actually measured their scores compared to graduating seniors, they were at the 78th percentile, right? Still better than almost, 4/5 of other university classes, but still there was some headroom. We then tested them again. We have not yet had a graduating class, so we tested them again at the end of their first year, just to see what 8 months at Minerva has done for them. And at the end of their first year, CLA Plus, but of course a different version of it, you don't give the same test twice, they scored at the 99th percentile of graduating seniors. In fact, not only did they score at the 99th percentile of graduating seniors, they scored higher than any other university class tested by the CLA. And they test hundreds of colleges and universities.
That's crazy. And I'm assuming they test Harvard, Stanford, MIT, all of them, right?
They test some elite schools, but frankly, most elite schools don't want to have their students take the CLA Plus. In fact, what the CLA has shown is that elite universities have some of the worst deltas between the beginning and the end. In fact, they have almost none. And those schools that generally show improvements are those that have students that maybe test in the 20th percentile as freshmen and then kind of inch up to the 30-something percentile when they graduate. So they add relative value, but they start from a relatively low base. There's almost, in fact, the CLA said they've never seen anything like this, where across 4 years to take really good students and make them that much better. And so effectively, what we have demonstrated is that in 8 months, we can bring students to a level that at least so far, no other university has demonstrated the ability to do across 4 years. And that's where he comes from.
So what are those main elements of the CLA Plus, right? You've mentioned a few of them, I think, offhand, right? Like critical reasoning skills, communication, reading and writing.
Critical thinking, effective communication, and problem solving. Those are the three primary things that it looks at. Scientific reasoning is another one.
So what are you doing differently then, where you're able to improve student scores this much where a normal university isn't? Because it's a huge difference.
It's a huge difference. And so this is kind of the shocking thing, and if we want to teach somebody how to cook, we teach them how to cook, right? And so rather than spending your first year at university taking a bunch of large lecture 101, 102 level courses that you can get online for free, right? Where you sit in a lecture, you take a couple of tests, you forget everything after the test that you took. In fact, it has been shown that lecture and test-based methodology enables 10% material retention after 6 months.
If that.
Right. I mean, if that, exactly. And so it might as well not exist. And so rather than taking great human potential and wasting its time and money, we actually constructed a curriculum that teaches component parts of 4 broad capacities. So one capacity is how to think critically. The second one is how to think creatively. The third is how to understand effective interactions, both interpersonal but also cross-systemic. So how, for example, economic systems interact with ecosystems, and in general complex system theory and applications. And then the last is effective communications, right? Now, each one of these components, or each one of these capacities, I should say, has many different components. So, for example, critical thinking is not a thing. One of the reasons that universities fail so spectacularly at teaching critical thinking is that if I was set out to just teach you critical thinking as a thing, some people say, oh, critical thinking is knowing what question to ask. Well, that's not actually true, right? That's an aspect of critical thinking, right? But one aspect of critical thinking is, for example, evaluating claims, right? So somebody makes a claim, right? And then you can evaluate a counterclaim to that, right? Or think of a counterclaim. Or you could use statistical analysis. Or you can think about the logic behind it or the reasoning behind it. So each one of these is different sub-techniques that actually needs to be taught separately in order for somebody to be adept at evaluating claims. Now, at the same time, there's a different kind of critical thinking. So, for example, decision trade-off. Do I take path A or path B? That's a form of critical thinking, right? But you have very different techniques used for that. So, for example, for that, you may use cost-benefit analyses, which you would not use for evaluating claims. And so altogether, these four broad capacities, we have about 100 of these elements that we teach. We refer to them as habits of mind and foundational concepts. Habits of mind are things that are automatically triggered, but then are hard to implement. So, for example, the counterclaim example. Somebody makes a claim. You say, oh, I heard a claim. I trigger a counterclaim. The hard part is, how do I think of a good counterclaim, right? So that's that piece. The foundational concept is the opposite, right? The concept is relatively easy to teach. You teach the statistical method. You learn the equation. You learn how to apply it. That's fine. The hard part is having the instinct as to when to apply what. So sometimes you say, well, look at a data set and maybe it has a normal distribution. Maybe it has a Poisson distribution. Maybe it has different distributions. And so how do you have the intuition to know what distribution to apply to what data set? That takes more time to study. So the first element is the fact that we actually teach these different things. But the second part, which is, in many cases more crucial, is this idea of far transfer. So if you think about what really education means, what is an educated person? What is a person who is wise? It's somebody who doesn't, just go around life and say, oh, I've encountered this exact scenario in my previous life or in previous career or something or in school, and I know how to solve it because I've done this exact thing. That's not an educated person. It's not a wise person. That's somebody who just has some experience. A wise person will encounter a novel problem, as almost all problems are, and say, okay, I see patterns in this problem that I have encountered in very different contexts in my past. And now I can take those past experiences and apply those elements to this novel context. This is what psychologists call far transfer. But the human mind is terrible at far transfer, terrible. And so there was a relatively interesting study done among many to prove this. And so, air traffic controllers, I don't know if you know anything about the world of air traffic control, but air traffic controllers are a remarkably manual job. You would imagine it would all be, everything is automated, but I don't know if it still is, but certainly when the study was done, highly manual. And so air traffic controllers are known as very, very good critical thinkers, right? Because they have to make these split-second decisions, so, airplanes don't collide, and adjusting for weather changes and things like that. And so a researcher gave air traffic controllers a critical thinking test, a general critical thinking test. And it turns out they did no better or worse than any other professional, right? In fact, no profession stood out, because when you give general tests, when apply subject matter knowledge or what you've learned from subject matter and abstract the concept and recontextualize, it's just not the way the brain is wired.
Is this kind of like the issue of domain dependence, where statisticians will fail at applying their understanding of statistics to real life situations?
Exactly. That is exactly the issue. Now, the way to solve this problem is actually to teach a conceptual idea in multiple contexts deliberately. So when you think about evaluation of claims, or you think about subcomponents of that, if you think about solving a problem and getting to the root of what the problem is that you're trying to solve before you solve it, a step that remarkably few people take, you don't just teach it in a context. You don't just teach it in the context of biology or medicine. You teach it in biology and economics and day-to-day life and interpersonal interactions, etc. And then when you've established that pattern for the learner, they're able to do original far transfer themselves. This is why we think of old people as wise, because over decades, they've made the same mistake over and over and over again in different contexts. And then finally, their brain is making those connections. But there's no reason for that to occur by accident. If you actually create it deliberately, then you can impart a real systemic education. And that's what we do. So not only do we introduce these 100 habits of minds and foundational concepts, but we contextualize and recontextualize them over and over and over again, not just in the first year, by the way, but across all 4 years of the Minerva curriculum. And so what we do is we provide students these systemic tools that they can use. And by the way, we deliver our education in these very small live video seminars, less than 20 students per class with a professor, where the students are fully active. The professor is not allowed to talk for more than 4 minutes at a time, but I've already violated 3 times over, right? So it's effectively a way to make sure that you engage the students with the material and they retain it. And that's really what we do that makes it so much better and more effective than a traditional education.
So if you're doing it all online, though, and if one of the core things you're trying to develop are communication skills, isn't that somewhat of an impediment? Because I feel like, especially with, we can say, my generation, one of the challenges is having these, fairly social lives online, and then you bring that to a real world conflict or a real world negotiation, and some of that maybe doesn't transfer. So how do you get over that hurdle?
I could imagine there could be some issues, especially when it comes to certain body language, even though much like you and I are talking online here, I see you relatively clearly. You see me in how I hand gesture, et cetera. If I were uncomfortable or to cross my hands, there would be you would notice that occurring. And so in that regard, you do get the bulk of the impact. Now, of course, there are always trade-offs. And so from a trade-off perspective, you certainly don't want to be teaching sculpture online or what have you, or I don't know, teaching somebody how to be a concert pianist, even though I've heard that some people do that online as well. But, there is some value of the mechanical education for certain fields, and we just don't teach them, right? But the benefit that we have in the environment that we've built is dramatic. And so what you can do with a camera pointing at your face, having analysis of the data that we generate in the course and how that builds into the personalized education of each student is one of the reasons why we're so effective at educating.
What about creative thinking? Because you mentioned that thinking creatively was one of the big things, and that seems like of the 4, maybe the one that would be the most difficult to deliberately teach.
Yeah, and so that's actually one of the funny things. So most people, when they think about creative thinking, in fact, most people who teach creative thinking try to teach it like voodoo, where it's, you go to a museum and you look at paintings and you're all of a sudden struck by bolts of lightning and are inspired to come up with the iPhone. It's in the popular imagination, right? It's in kind of the concept of what creative thinking is, but doesn't bear reality at all in creative thinking. Creative thinking turns out to be highly systemic, right? You have hypotheses, you try to solve a problem, you get to the root cause of the problem, you think more broadly about it, you think about, you can create processes of thinking about, well, how do you ideate around a purpose? So you have a goal, you identify the issues of the problem, then you think about, well, what can I bring to bear to help solve this problem? What are some potential opportunities, et cetera? It's a very, very systemic process. And in fact, the scientific method is a great example of creative thinking. Some of the most creative people in the world are scientists that make groundbreaking discovery. There is nothing more systemic than the scientific process. And that's something that you can teach. Now, creative thinking also comes from deep expertise, right? It's very fashionable these days to, I speak like a 90-year-old man, but, in the Silicon Valley culture, which I'm, of course, steeped in, there's this glorification of the know-nothing generalist. That they say, I have no expertise in anything, but, I can do this, I can do that. Well, I struggle to think of a single figure in history who was a generalist. There were people who were polymaths, right? That's different, right? Who were experts at many things. But I truly don't remember anybody who goes down in posterity for positive things in the world that was, dabbled in this, dabbled in that, wasn't really good at anything, but hey, was decent altogether. And I'm sure somebody can come up with examples. but they are dwarfed by those who were massively creative because of their expertise. And frankly, the greater the depth, the greater the expertise, in many cases, the greater the creativity. And so it isn't voodoo, it's not magic, and it can absolutely be taught systemically.
Speaking of expertise there, since you brought it up, is that something that you try to give students before they graduate too? Because one of the things that I think is a fairly legitimate criticism of a lot of colleges is that students graduate, one, not really having learned anything in their classes, and then two, they're not actually good at anything on top of that.
Exactly right. And so Minerva really imparts two broad competencies when you graduate, if you want to think about it that way. So competency number one is this very broad practical knowledge tool set. And it's everything from what we do in the classroom to the global immersion where students live around the world, to cultural competencies, etc. The second element is deep expertise in a particular subject. And we do that in a way that other universities do not, primarily because we avoid the two core traps of traditional university curricula or major education, right? Not the general education, but the subject matter. So we all know that general education universities doesn't make any sense because it doesn't really exist. It's you take a bunch of random courses, right, that have no interconnection and no structure whatsoever. But at the very least, they could argue the major has a curriculum, right? And you want to study physics, you have to take intro this, intro that, intermediate that, and then upper level this, that, and the other. And there's a structure to the major. Now, we have a very, very different approach because if you look at traditional university course catalogs, they are largely broken into two types of courses. Course number one is disseminate information, right? This is the large lecture courses where you sit in and they just tell you facts and figures and you're supposed to remember them for a test and then forget them. We don't believe in those courses at all. And not that it's not important to know the basic facts and figures, of course, it's crucial, but we don't think that you should be paying $5,000 for somebody to read a book out loud to you over a semester, which is what the cost is of a course in a traditional private university, which is, it's criminal, right? it's literally a guy standing up and reading a book. My 6-year-old daughter doesn't let me read to her anymore, right? Because she's done. She's like, I can read now, Dad. Leave me alone, right? So so we don't do any of those courses. We tell our students go online. There are a plethora of MOOCs and all the rest. We particularly like this MOOC, but you can get this content any way you want. And then we give them self-study questions that say, if you can answer these questions, then you are ready for Minerva level courses.
Oh, so you actually don't give them the, let's say like we're doing calculus. You don't give them a calculus textbook. You say, you have to solve this problem. Go figure out how to do it.
Exactly.
Ah, that's so cool. I love that.
And we don't charge them for it. We don't charge them for the privilege. We don't say, we have a credit-bearing authority vested to us by the regional accreditor. So for us to certify that you know basic economics, you pay us $5,000, please. So we don't do that, right?
And pay $100 for the textbook our professor wrote.
Exactly. Well, and $100 if it's cheap. I have a friend who has a son who goes to an unnamed elite university whose professor assigned their book. The book they assigned was $950.
It's insane.
Yeah. So anyway, that's a different criminal activity. So the second aspect of course catalog. So these knowledge dissemination courses are a small portion of the courses in course catalogs, but it's a large percentage of the credits issued, right? Because you don't have that many 101, 102 level courses. Every field has them, but there are 500 people taking that course every semester as opposed to having 50 or 5 taking the upper level courses. So we eliminate that. The second thing is the upper level courses. Most upper level courses at universities are the hobbies of the professor, right? Why is there a course on the Renaissance gardens of Italy and not the Victorian gardens of England, right? It's because you have a professor who is expert in one and knows nothing about the other. And so they say, I did my PhD about this, so clearly it's crucial. Yet you go to the other university, all of a sudden it's like, no. Who cares about the Renaissance gardens of Italy? You want to know about the Victorian gardens of England, right? So of course it's absurd. So we have neither of these courses, right? Now, what do we have? Instead, Minerva offers courses that are of one of two kinds. The one kind are courses that we believe are seminal. They're either seminal ideas that apply to any field. That's our freshman year curriculum. Seminal ideas that are relevant to a cluster of fields. For example, ideas that are relevant in the computational sciences or business or arts and humanities, right? That traverse disciplinary boundaries. or seminal ideas that occur at the intersection of fields, at the very advanced level, right? So discovery and creativity rarely exist within a very narrow field. It's usually where two or three fields meet. And so there are a lot of tools and techniques and concepts that people need to know in order to master that. And so we have a very, very, very small course catalog, but every single class that we offer is both highly designed but crucial to know, to the point where if you want to be called an expert in any of these fields and you don't have mastered the material that we teach, you can't really call yourself an expert in it, right? And so it solves the big piece. Now, the second course that we offer, or type of course we offer, was actually not something we certify and do, but you can't find a listing of it, are what we refer to as tutorials. So this is modeled after Oxford or Cambridge, and that is the upper level courses, right? So when you study physics, there are some seminal ideas that are crucial, both underpinning physics, but also for physics itself and its intersection with other fields. But then there are a million different branches of physics that you as a student may want to explore. So rather than asking our faculty, what do you feel like teaching? We then, when the student is ready in their senior year, go to the student and say, what would you like to learn? And three students together come up with their idea for what it is that they want to learn. And then we match them with the most appropriate professor. They build the syllabus together, and that's the course that they take. And that's the bulk of the senior year, both tutorials and a capstone project that the student does on their own. And so when we offer a course at Minerva, it's a course which is crucial for your intellectual development, not for content you acquire on the outside, but it's for the application of that content. And then when it comes to the branching out, we go to the student themselves and we have the student decide what field they want to explore, what particular focus they want to explore. And then we structure the curriculum personalized to that individual.
And for those ones where they're trying to learn this more specific thing, do you have to pull from the professors that you already have at Minerva, or are you going out and trying to find somebody beyond and pitching them on working with these students?
Both. So we'll have both our current faculty, which have very broad expertise, but if there's a particularly esoteric subject matter that our faculty are truly not able to be guides for, then we would go external.
And how big is, let's say, this year's senior class?
Well, we have no seniors yet. So we have three classes so far. So we have our first, second, and third years, all of which are starting next week. So our first graduating class will be in May of 2019. But our classes are roughly, our very first class is just over 100 students. Our second class is about 150. Our third class is 200. So we've kind of traditionally grown at pace, even though we have no goals for admissions. We accept 100% of qualified students. It's just that our qualifications are very, very high. And so last year we had, for this incoming group of 200 students, we had more than 20,000 applicants, 20,400 to be exact, from 179 different countries. We had more applicants than Dartmouth or MIT did this year.
And you had the lowest acceptance rate of any college in the country.
1.9%.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Well, it's
it's impressive. Yeah.
The schools themselves are trying to pick those individuals who are going to make decisions of consequence in the future, who will be in positions that will make decisions that impact the lives of many, many other people. And going through this type of program, not just the academic program, which we actually think every university should offer, but this idea of this global rotation and immersion and all of the other things we do at the Minerva Schools is a privilege which really is meant for a very, very small number of students. And, you know, what I think is most gratifying about our process is that our admissions process is done strictly based on merit, strictly. And so we have no idea who your mommy and daddy are. We don't use any proxies for wealth, right? So, for example, you know, traditional need-blind, quote-unquote, university, which is the biggest lie perpetuated in higher education, has all of these triggers, right? They don't ask you how rich you are, but what they do is they ask you for all sorts of proxies to how wealthy you are. For example, what do your mother and father do? Where did they go to school? Did they go to our school? Do you sail? Do you play tennis? Do you play golf? And so what happens is that these need-blind institutions like the Ivy League have 50% of their student body come from the 1% wealthiest households in the world. And if you believe that intelligence is concentrated among the children of the wealthy, then I've got a lot of non-existent bridges to sell you, right? Because it's just not true. And so our process, which doesn't look at any of those things, and a number of other things in the application which bias against the non-wealthy, yields a student body which is about a tenth as concentrated in the top 1% as a traditional Ivy League university. So rather than having about 50% of our students come from the top 1%, we're probably at the mid-single digits. And it's a huge, huge, huge difference.
And is that because you are just looking at their ability to perform on the Minerva application, or do you deliberately try to create a diverse class?
No, actually, that's actually the amazing thing. There's nothing we do to curate the class, literally nothing. We have a bar, and if you pass the bar, you're in. And the bar is made up of three components, which is how you do in high school. You got to do well, whatever context you are. So we don't say, oh, you went to, there's another great way that universities discriminate. They say, oh, okay, you were, second in your class in a really, really bad public high school. Well, you can't possibly be good, forget it. Or, oh, you were like in the 50th percentile of Phillips Exeter. Oh, that's such a great school. Yeah, we'll take you, which is,
I went to Choate, so I'm
yeah. So you
I know, yeah.
the deal, right? And so if you top out, we're not going to say that you couldn't have done better just because you were in the wrong neighborhood. And so we give credit. So the valedictorian of Choate will have the same credit as the valedictorian of a random public high school in Kenya.
I love that because I feel like that gets around some of the problem you get with purely like race-based affirmative action, where you have, the people who don't need it necessarily because they're already in the top 1% of wealth, but they get in off of that card, right?
Exactly. There was a great book called Place Not Race. It was written by, I think, a sociologist a couple of years ago. And she argued, all of this need blind thing it's nonsense, right? It actually helps discriminate, right? And then you wind up saying, oh, let's do race. And you wind up bringing in African princes to look at how diverse our body is. And she says, you want to solve this? It's super simple. Admit by zip code, right? If you really want to curate the class, by zip code how wealthy the applicant is, and don't be blind to their need. Be conscious of it. Be conscious and say, you know what? We wanted something that broadly represents the socioeconomic spectrum of the United States, broadly represent the zip codes, right? And you're done, right? You're solved. You've gotten your diverse student body. We approach it from a different perspective, which is we just remove the advantages of wealth as much as we can in the process. And so we look at your grades. We have our own set of assessments. So we don't use SATs, which again, you're wealthy. You have 200 points extra on the SATs. You have prep classes, etc.
Yeah, you get to take it 3 or 4 times.
You get to take it 3 or 4 times, exactly. We don't look at pre-written essays. We do an essay and a verbal interview on camera live, and we don't know what the essay is, so your college counselor can't help you.
Oh, smart. Or your parents can't write it.
Parents can't write it for you. So once again, removes that thing. And then we look at kind of what your personal story is outside of the academic setting. And we don't really care if your parents flew you to India to build a shelter for someone. Mostly care about what you've accomplished given
service trips.
Right, exactly. So we're really focused on getting to the heart of the individual. And when you do that, we don't discriminate against wealthy people. Of course, nothing wrong with brilliant people who happen to be born into great circumstances. That's wonderful. But we certainly don't advantage them further in the process because they're just naturally advantaged given circumstance.
And then you've turned it into this global campus on top of attracting a really global student body. So where did that decision come from? Because there's 5 residential campuses, right? And then 7 other? Okay.
Yeah, right. So your first year is in San Francisco. And then the next 6 semesters, the 3 years, are spent in 6 different cities. You go from San Francisco to Seoul, Seoul to Hyderabad, Hyderabad to Berlin, Berlin to Buenos Aires, Buenos Aires to London, London to Taipei, and then you come back to San Francisco for graduation. And by the way, in each place, there is no campus. There's a residence hall. And the idea is that you live as a resident of that city. So we don't give you a gym. We don't give you cafeterias. We bring you into a building where all the students live together and we have programming for them and integration in the city. But you want to eat, you got to go to the supermarket, local restaurant or something like that. You want to exercise, go to the park join a gym. We want to get you adept at living in these various contexts, which, by the way, is part of FAR transfer training.
Well, and also just being an adult.
Exactly. And very much being.
It's pretty easy to to graduate from college and then be terrified by the prospect of having to live on your own or cook your own food and all of that.
Correct. So our baby step to adulthood is that this adulthood is supervised, right? In the sense that we have staff living in the buildings and all the rest, but it's very much a transition into the real world, right? And so we take the step which we think all colleges should be taking. So in some ways, I actually am a big fan of the idea of the campus for high school students, many ways like Choate, right? The concept of, in high school, you have a level of independence, you work, you live in a campus or you're enjoying a campus, and if you commute, you kind of navigate that bubble world. That's a good step. But when you're, 18, 19, 20, guess what? You're like right around the corner. And so, you have to work over the summers, you have to do internships. So it is time for adulthood. And that's how we're structured. So the idea came from, funny enough, one of my experiences in college. I happened to meet an amazing man who gave me a job between my third and fourth year of college, which was to spend a semester in Singapore working for the Walt Disney Company, helping them start a new division, which was crazy. It was a crazy, crazy opportunity.
That's an awesome gig.
Best internship by far at my university. And it was just because I randomly met this person who happened to be an executive at Disney. And so it was a great opportunity. And I'd never been to Asia before in my life. This was more than 20 years ago. And I learned more in that 3-month stint in Singapore than I did in the previous 3 years at college. And I said, this is nuts, right? I mean, and by the way, the people who I knew that went on study abroad had an awesome time drinking and, partying, but they didn't do anything, right? Classes were a joke, right? They were with a bunch of other Americans in Florence. They didn't talk to any of the locals. And so, they didn't have a very good, they had a great experience, had a lot of fun, but it wasn't rational. I said, every university needs to force this kind of experience, right? They've got to get people out of just the campus context and get them living, being resident in the real world in various parts of the world. And so that's really where it came from. It's actually the only part of Minerva's design which isn't based on the science of learning or empirical cross-study evidence, because I don't really think there's a control group that you could have done this for. It just comes from intuition, which is if you wind up living in 7 different countries, better than living in one place for 4 years as far as your maturation and growth. So it's logical, but it's not empirical.
Well, I kind of did that for myself after graduating. I was in Austin for a bit, and then after I left Austin, I lived in Paris, New York, Buenos Aires, San Francisco. I was traveling through Asia for about 2 months, and something about living in other cities, especially in other countries, it just changes your relationship with your own country and with how you think about, I think, work and life. And we're definitely approaching that stage professionally, in the world, where this idea of you live in this one city and work this one job and you sort of never leave it for your whole life is going out the window very quickly. And so I feel like going through that kind of program where you do have to move around and adapt to new cities and pick up some of the language quickly, right? That's going to be an incredibly valuable skill the next few years.
Without question. And we're already seeing it even among, so first, despite the fact that our students are rotating all over the world, many students choose to spend their summers in yet another country during their internships. And we see it all the time. I visit, 25 countries a year just for work. And, we have a student who in her first year at Minerva, so all of our students are in residence, but, because we take courses via the platform, if you need to, go home or, go somewhere, you can just, you don't have to miss class because you take class with you. And so we had one student who is from Kenya and is a pretty remarkable entrepreneur and has a relatively high profile. And she was flown on other people's dime, right, to speak at different conferences throughout her freshman year at Minerva, and obviously since then. So she took classes in her freshman year, despite the fact that she lived in San Francisco. She took classes from 10 different countries, which is part of the concept of this world, right? Which is you can't really live in isolation anymore.
Well, and I feel like it gives so much trust back to the students where, traditionally university would have been something that you go to because you want to learn and you want to set yourself up for a better life. And at least in the US, it's really transitioned more towards, no, this is a thing you have to do if you want to be viable. And for most students, it ends up being a game of, okay, how much can I maximize my drinking and partying relative to class time and, offset the work through cheating and sharing notes and cramming at the last second and all of that.
Or grade inflation. But the university is fully complicit. The university is fully complicit in the process. I often say that the most controversial belief that Minerva has is that education matters. And people, are always taken aback by this because they say, we believe education matters. Everybody believes education matters. And I say, actually, the fact of the matter is that almost no one believes that education matters because people believe that the credential matters. Right. And this is how they make their decision. They say, I'm going to go to university, which is ranked number 1 versus university that's ranked number 7 because it's ranked higher. Not to stop and say, wait a second, well, what am I actually going to learn at that university? But it turns out that if you just stop and think critically about it and think about your own life, most parents who send their kids to college have some say, whether they're managers or on interviewing committees for fellow employees or wherever they work. And when in their entire history have they looked at a resume and say, oh, this student went to Stanford, this student went to Harvard, or this applicant went to Harvard or Stanford, they're hired. That's never happened. It's never happened to them. It's never happened to anybody they know. What happens is that they go sit down for an interview. Oftentimes, they don't even know where they went to undergrad, or it's a tiny portion of their decision making. And then they interview them. They see what they know. They see how they can solve problems. They see how they can break problems down into component parts. They think about, how they think about unintended consequences, how well they communicate, how well they interact with other people. All of the things that universities don't actually teach, but we all know are crucial. And the fact of the matter is that when it comes to their own children, rather than saying, wait a second, I know how I make hiring decisions. I know how all my friends make hiring decisions. I know what actually matters for the world, which is how well you think systemically. All of a sudden, they revert to these automatons saying, must go to a prestigious university. And a lot of it, by the way, is for bragging rights. A lot of it is when they're at the supermarket and they see, the other parent and they say, well, my kid goes here, they get to crow up like peacocks. But that's no reason to commit malpractice on your own child. So the other thing that we say is, if your son or daughter needed to have brain surgery, you would not take them to the hospital that makes other people think highly of you. You would take them to the best possible hospital you can find, right? The one that'll actually perform the surgery best. Well, education is brain surgery. It rewires your brain, right? And so you can send your children to brain surgery where actually the hospital, in this case the university, asks the student, what part of your brain would you like me to cut today? Would you like me to take that part out or this part out? It's like, it doesn't really matter if you learn anything. It doesn't really matter if I make a wrong incision. I'm just going to say the operation was a success and give you a degree. Or are you going to take them to a hospital, in this case a university, and actually develops the mind? It actually enhances it in a systemic way. It's not even a real option. But people have to reframe their thinking of how crucial education actually is.
Yeah, and I think that it's so big at the college level for all the reasons that we've been talking about, right? Where there are all of these systemic issues, and especially, I think, parents pushing kids maybe into things that are best for the parents or the parents' perceptions, not necessarily best for the kids. So have you had any issues with students getting their parents to get them on board with Minerva? Is that a challenge for you guys?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look, the majority of students that we select to Minerva wind up matriculating, which is remarkable in and of itself because we're a brand new institution. So we do have the faith of the majority of the students we select, which is really better than we've expected. But without question, our yield, which is the percentage of students that wind up matriculating versus those that you offer, which for us has always been in the 50s, so more than half, if it were not for parent intervention, would have been in the 70s.
Mm. Do you hear that from students that their parents are concerned about it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we hear it from students. We try to talk to, but some parents won't even discuss with us. They say, oh my God, my kid got into, Ivy League X and I don't want to even talk, hear, see anything else. This is my lifelong dream. It's effectively somebody who for their entire lives thought that in the 60s that they're going to buy their kid a Cadillac when they graduate and they have an opportunity to buy a Tesla. Right. And they say, oh, I don't want to know about the Tesla because, oh, heaven forbid that it'll shatter my dream of the 65 Cadillac, which has no airbags and no seatbelt. Right. So
it's a good analogy.
And that's actually the issue. And some people will not engage. And to me, those are, always a university will select a student that is not the right fit for them. And they decide to go to other universities for many legitimate reasons. And that's fine. But those group of students for whom the parents are just obstinate, that breaks my heart. And it's so clearly better for their own children. And their children see it. It's not like they're oblivious to this fact, but they just cannot get their parents to just examine the facts, not to even take a leap of faith, but actually to just do the analysis. And that's sad.
What about pre-college education? Have you thought about that at all? Because you said you have a daughter who's 6, right? And I feel like if you have this much understanding and involvement in the college system, you probably think about primary and secondary education as well. So I'll just leave that open. How are you thinking about that as a parent?
Well, it's painful. And it's painful because many of the ailments of college exist in primary and secondary education. The one slight benefit of the primary and secondary education system is that, in theory, the employees of those institutions of higher learning only have one job, which is to educate. Whereas at a university, they actually get hired to do research and then are forced to educate. And so they know nothing about education. Now, many teachers don't know either, but at least they want to. They're there to teach. That is their job, right? And so you wind up having, at least from my personal experience, from what I see, a much higher percentage of good teachers in primary and secondary education than is a percentage of good teachers in university, simply because it's not their primary job. So at least from a personal level, it's better. Look, primary and secondary education is a problem because, especially in the United States, there is no systemic way to reform it unless you reform higher education. Now, this is another very controversial piece, right? Because primary and secondary education is managed at the district level. And then even within district, they only control the public schools of that district, right? So in a district could be a very small county. And so that county may have 5 schools in its purview, but there could be a parochial school there, a private school there that don't fall under that purview. And the other problem is it's not a competitive market in the sense that no public high school in Oakland says, I wonder what Choate's doing this year. They don't care. Right? So if Choate is actually doing the good things for education, it doesn't have influence on other schools because they're just not in competition. And so in general, there's not much that could be systemically done, except if universities will change their criteria. Right? So if you reform universities, that has huge trickle-down effects because actually universities dictate systemic curricula for high school. So as an example, the UC system in California the University of California system says, if you want us to consider your students for admission, you must offer them this number of credits in this subject, etc. So if the UC system says, you know what, we don't want to look at calculus anymore, we want to look at statistics, every high school in California teaches statistics the next year, like that, right? And so the impact could be very systemic if you fix higher ed. The little bit, what we do with our daughter, we have 2 daughters, 6 and 1, but we put her in the French American school. Not because we have any connection to France whatsoever, good food, good wine, but outside of that, being immersed in a second language is crucial for brain development. So whether or not you learn or don't learn in traditional classes, if you are forced to be in a different language environment, your brain development advances dramatically. And so you can use basic elements of the science of learning to at least put your children in environments that push them and compensate for the fact that in many ways the educational systems are broken.
Yeah, that makes sense. And one of the things in there was this notion of the teachers who want to teach, right? And it seems like you've focused entirely on that. There's no research or anything at Minerva, right?
Well, some of our professors do research, but we don't have goals for them such that they have to do research in order to keep their jobs. And the reason for that is the pressure to do research if you're a professor is enormous. You can't escape it, right? Your entire professional...
It's how you get tenure, right?
Well, we don't have tenure, but it's how you get tenure at other institutions. It's how your colleagues perceive of you as good in your profession, right? So imagine it's like basketball players who do community service, right? No basketball team is going to say, oh, let me get that player because he does a lot of community service and he's good for our community relations. They'll say, I want to know their stats on the court. The stats on the court in higher education have nothing to do with education. That is your community service. It has to do with how much you publish and all the rest. And so in that system, but we actually care about the education part, right? And so the rest of the sector forces the faculty to think about the research. We don't need to apply any additional pressure.
So how do you get good faculty to come work with you instead of at these other institutions then? Because I feel like if they're there and they're not as focused on research, it could be harder for them to go back to traditional academia after, right?
Yeah. And so for some, but for others, the current academic system is quite brutal. So if universities had to eat their young, if universities had to actually hire all the PhDs they produce, they would have to fire the entire professoriate every 2 years. So huge overproduction, right? And so what happens is that in order to go from getting your PhD to being a tenured professor, you have to go through this very rigid winnowing process that's rigid in terms of number of years. So you go from your PhD to a postdoc, and then after your postdoc, you try to get a tenure track position, and then you've got 7 years, and if you don't make tenure in those 7 years, your career is over. Because if you don't get a tenure at Columbia, you're not going to get tenure at Princeton. You're not going to get tenure at Tufts. You're going to go 3 or 4 tiers down, and it's not a good thing for your career. And so at Minerva, we have no tenure track, right? So let's say that you just got your PhD, maybe you did your postdoc, and you're now thinking, hey, am I going to be a tenure track professor at Columbia, or am I going to be a professor at Penn that doesn't have tenure, or at Penn that is an adjunct, or maybe I'm going to go to Minerva, which doesn't have tenure at all? Well, at Minerva, maybe your breakthrough research will happen in 4 years. Maybe it'll happen in 10. Maybe it'll happen in 15. At that time, if you do happen to hit the publishing jackpot, universities are going to come calling anyway with tenured positions, not tenure track, but they're going to give you the tenure. But you're not going to have that timeline where if you don't have it in 7 years, your career is over. And so even for those professors, there is a substantial benefit to the Minerva track than going to traditional university. Now, if you have had tenure at a university and you hate to teach and you want to kind of chill out and do nothing, A, we don't want you, but B, you should never come to Minerva, right? It's
right.
Not, it's not what we're set up to do.
So, but it sounds like you're probably then really attracting professors who want to teach.
Absolutely. Want to teach and believe in it.
Yeah. And once you probably really appreciate how engaged and I guess active the student body is in terms of you're not in these huge lectures, you're actually in these classes discussing things.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Yeah. I guess, was this something that was really obvious to you when you were at UPenn, or is it something you realized later? Is it something you wanted to work on since college, or?
Yeah. In fact, my freshman year, I took a course and wrote a paper that actually was the first instantiation of the Minerva curriculum. So it goes back all the way there. Yeah.
Are there any others out there like Minerva that you think are doing a good job of this right now?
Unfortunately, no. There are institutions that are doing things somewhat differently. Olin College in engineering. There's Quest in Canada, which uses some elements of the science of learning. But the problem with most institutions, even the ones that are trying to do things differently, is that they usually come from the perspective of, let me take a university structure and then improve it as much as I can from that basis. And so the improvements that you see at these types of newer programs and institutions are highly incremental.
Right. Little 10% improvements.
Exactly. We approach it from a completely different way. We in fact have a book coming out next month, which is called Building the Intentional University. Because everything that we do is intentional. It goes back to first principles. And so we think first and foremost, what do we want our students to be doing after they graduate in the rest of their careers? And then we build back from that perspective, not just the curriculum, not just the pedagogy, not just the student experience, but the entire institutional design, the admissions process, the cost structure, everything. And so if you want to have a step change impact on outcomes, which we've demonstrated that we have, you have to reimagine the nature of the program. And that's unfortunately not something we've seen outside of Minerva. And that actually is quite surprising to us because, some people could interpret and look at what we've accomplished in the results and the scores and things like that and say, oh my God, what you guys have done is amazing. And not to try to take away from really incredible work that everybody on the Minerva team has done. But we're the first systemic reimagining of higher education in more than a century. And on our first try, we have the kinds of results that no one else has ever been able to see. I mean, it's really not about how great we are. It's about how terrible everything else is. I guarantee you that a historian looking back 50 years in the past, so 50 years from now, that will look at our program in our first 1 or 2 years will laugh. They'll say, oh my God, look at all the mistakes they've made. Look at all the problems that they were so obvious that they didn't know how to solve, etc. Because it's the first attempt, right? And we iterate every single year. We see every year how we get better and better and better. But the fact that our first attempt was so much better than everybody else is less a testament to our genius or anything silly like that. It really is just a testament to the fact that how much you need systemic rethinking across the board, and more new institutions that will start with first principles and build their institution intentionally. In fact, that's why we hope the book will inspire other groups, individuals, people to create things that will show us new ideas that we can copy from and improve upon.
Yeah, I think it's easy to forget that no major improvement to any system has ever really happened by iterating on the old one. And so I've been hoping and kind of looking for things like Minerva, where it's basically saying, okay, we're just going to effectively toss out the old system, start from scratch. If we end up with parts of the old system, okay, cool, great, they're probably good. But if we don't, then okay, we probably didn't need those. You mentioned that there have been iterations each year. So what have been some of the big learnings over the last 2 years or parts of the system that you might have changed?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, a lot of it has been in, it's actually funny because when you build a brand new system, systems have their own constraints, right? And so you wind up doing iterations at that point. So you start from a brand new concept, new system, and then you do your 10% improvements every single year, which is why we postulate that somebody else who will learn from us and create an even better system and then do their iterations will force us to redo our system from scratch as well, which is my hope. My hope is that somebody will be able to show us how to do that.
Good, healthy competition.
Yeah. But, look, we redo every single one of our lesson plans that needs redoing, right? And so we go back and it's all very systemic. We've learned a lot about the experiential integration, what programs work for students, what don't, what engages them, what living situations are optimal versus not. And some of them are counterintuitive, right? So, for example, last year we had our second year students in Berlin and Buenos Aires. And, in Berlin, they were in these apartments with living rooms and big central courtyard and things like that. In Buenos Aires, they were effectively in a hotel with kind of a common area in the lobby. And so we thought, oh my God, Berlin is going to be so great and they're going to have so much space and they're going to get spoiled and, and all the rest. I mean, how are they going to move into the hotel and it's less room, et cetera, even though, the hotels had kitchenettes and things like that. And it was the exact opposite. They hated the apartments. They didn't have a common area. They had a common area for the three of them that lived in the apartment, but they didn't see one another, right? And then in September, Berlin was nice, so they met out in the common courtyard in the lawn, but in October it got cold. So October, November, December, they didn't see each other, right? And so it's really interesting learning is to wait a second, so you would imagine that they want this, but actually they're more hungry for the community. So you get some interesting learnings that come out of it. But it is mostly, and again, this is kind of the local maxima issue, the results have been so good. The outcomes, despite the fact that we have many things to fix and many elements to improve, we're not really motivated to do a major rewrite because it works. It works so well.
What about the science of learning? Because you've mentioned it a couple of times. And is that a body of research, a collection of books? Because a lot of people listening are, kind of like me, we're relatively autodidactic and we really get into this stuff. And is that something that anybody can go study and try to apply to their own life?
Absolutely. So, by the way, if you are interested in that, our book is very, it's approachable, it's readable, but it's highly technical, it's highly referenced, it's an academic book. And so if you really want to understand the science of learning, our book is a wonderful place to start because it gives you all of the research that underpins the principles that we've abstracted, our chief academic officer has abstracted, that wound up building the system. But it is a vast literature. It's literatures, really. And one of the reasons that's never really been implemented is that it does take a polymath, which our founding chief academic officer is, to be able to bridge all of the research in all of the various fields of the science of learning, because it is a broad set of fields, and then abstract it into principles that you can then apply into institutional and curricular design. And so there are some things that are very, very simple, but there are other things that are really quite deep and complicated. In fact, there are 16 broad principles that Dean Coslin, our founding dean, abstracted into bring together the ground for the curriculum that we've built. And so the 16 principles, in short, break down into 2 meta categories, and based on how well you remember and retain information. And so category number 1 has a lot to do with how deeply you process. So passive information, lecture, it's basically the same brainwaves in the lecture as you do when you're sleeping. So you truly don't have.
It's about how I felt during lectures. Yeah.
So you truly don't process and deep processing. And there's really interesting, fascinating studies on how crucial deep processing is for memory. And the second is making associations. And so if you do those 2 things, you get both deep processing, but you both get memory, but it also enables you the underpinnings to enable far transfer, especially the association part.
Okay. And so we'll definitely link to your guys' book so that anybody listening can pick it up. Are there any others that you would recommend on the subject?
Well, there are a whole bunch. Diane Halpern, who was one of our deans at Minerva in our first year, wrote a book on the elements of critical thinking, right? If you want to approach kind of from that perspective. There are people like Eric Mazur, who's done a lot of work and research at Harvard on the science of active learning as opposed to passive learning. Daniel Willingham at UT is another expert on many things science of learning oriented. So they're all referenced in the book as well, but it's a long, long list. It's a large set of research.
And are there any other books that you would want everyone going to Minerva to read? Or I don't know, maybe you assign books, maybe you don't. But
yeah, it's actually interesting. So one of our things is that we try not to be content specific, right? We're concept specific, right? And so the great books curricula says everyone must read these books. And we say, no. Everyone should have these great cognitive tools as opposed to these great books. And so, of course, they're great books I'd love people to read, but the tools-based books, so for example, everyone at Minerva effectively reads Thinking Fast and Slow, which is Danny Kahneman's book, which is a spectacular book. And there are things of that ilk, but we do try to keep it towards the cognitive tool side as opposed to the inspired works that will then lead to abstractions of them could hopefully generate those tools. We're more direct.
And what about for you? What were some of those books for you?
Oh my God. For me, so I unfortunately was brought up in the abstraction world, right? So for me, I didn't, grow up on science of learning. So for me, it was Dostoevsky and Maimonides. And so I have a very bizarre set of inspirations, but it's actually really interesting. I was just talking to someone a couple of weeks ago who, when I described what we're doing, he said, oh, that's very Maimonidean, your philosophy. He said, you're the first person in 7 years who has noticed that, because Maimonides was a huge influence for me. And I actually took a deep course on Maimonides when I was in my first year of undergrad, in parallel to writing this paper. And so it was kind of a fascinating thing. So anyway, Dewey is another one, Franklin. So Franklin's Philosophies in Education, Dewey's Philosophies in Education are very much informed, and Jefferson's as well, very much informed our concept of what higher education is.
Any just last thoughts or things you wanted to leave the audience with? I know Minerva's applications are open, right?
Yeah, they are. So applications are open. It's on www.minerva.kgi.edu. KGI is a Keck Graduate Institute where Minerva is incubated and is one of the Claremont colleges. Applications are free. So one of the ways in which we don't try to discriminate is
smart
financial barrier in front of applicants.
Wait, how do you process 20,000 applications? Because it's a relatively small team, right?
Yeah, well, so students are actually the primary application processors. So we have 60 students working on processing applications. It's actually the largest team at Minerva. So
students get to look at the applications from other students, and then it filters up from there?
Yeah, they look at component parts, and they use rubrics to grade each of the component parts. And so it's a very systemic, highly laborious process.
Yeah, but I love that the students get to be involved in it because it goes back to sort of that idea of it being an education student driven process. How long are applications open? How long do people have?
We actually keep our applications open for quite a long time because we get a lot of European applicants, and so they apply in the February-March timeframe. So if they open August 1st, and they're open now, obviously opened August 1st, and they go until I think March 1st or 15th. And one of the unique characteristics of our application process for those people who see that Minerva is for them, that they're convinced that this is the right thing, and obviously Minerva is almost binary. It's either the best place for you or you shouldn't be here. We have an option in our application called binding applications. And binding applications basically say, look, if I get into Minerva, it's my first choice, I'm coming. And you can check that at any time. It's not like an early decision versus not. And once you finish your application, you get an answer within 4 weeks. So, you could, in theory, apply today, finish your application 3 days from now, and get an answer from us about whether or not you're going to be a student next year before the early decision application deadlines of any other school.
That's a good deal. Very cool. Okay, well, are you active online at all? Like on Twitter or anywhere that people should follow you?
Quora. I tend to answer a lot of questions on Quora, so and sometimes on Reddit. I've done a couple of AMAs and Minerva Schools tweets, but I don't really. So as you may be able to tell from this conversation, I prefer long form deep answers as opposed to superficial ones, which is again very much a Minerva thing. So I like more long form social opportunities.
Well, I have a bad habit of ending up turning my explanations into 10 minutes or 4,000 words. So I find Twitter is actually good for quelling that impulse.
Yes, right.
So
I'm not evolved enough to be able to edit down my...
Well, Ben, this was so much fun. I told you in the beginning, I was really looking forward to this. And I love what you guys are doing. I think there'll be a lot of people in the audience who are either interested or who know someone who'll be interested. And I'm excited to see it continue to grow from here. So yeah, thank you again. And we'll include links to everything in the show notes so people can find it. And have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Nat Chat. If you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to Nat Chat in iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Second, if you're trying to take advantage of some of the information from this episode, be sure you check out the show notes at nateliason, nateliason.com/podcast, and find a friend, because implementing a lot of this stuff is much easier if you have somebody to do it with. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode and you've been enjoying other episodes of the podcast, please leave it a review on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you listen to your casts so that more people can find it. This is the best way for it to get some more exposure and to make sure that I can keep bringing these episodes to you. With that, thank you and have an awesome rest of your day.